Hello?
Hello.
Hey.
Hi there, I'm Allie. I'm the monitor for your session.
Thank you.
How's it going with the setup?
I think I just hit the right button, but I can't really confirm that.
Okay, if you minimize that screen and go into the Google, okay, so it is registering the sound. Oh, and we are broadcast.
Yeah, I think this is all happening. People are
fabulous.
getting treated to this meta ramble.
Cool. All right, so then you just have a couple more minutes.
Okay.
All right. All right. I'll be right back.
All right.
Cool.
Thanks. Hi. Hi. Are we good? Cool.
Yes.
Hi. I like small groups. We can all sit, we can actually potentially even have a little conversation. Yeah. Yeah, actually on that note, maybe we can huddle slightly. Not to, I know it's Saturday morning. We don't have to like get crazy. But just because we're a small group, it might be nice to actually like have a little back and forth. So, so yeah, this is a subject that's really dear to my heart. It's like a gap analysis is a term that you may, has anybody heard the term at all? You have? Good. It's amazing. Hey. Hey. Yeah, I was thinking because it's a small group, we can kind of huddle and even have slight conversation if we're so moved. So yeah, so the term is thrown around. It's sort of it's a jargony term that you'll hear in kind of formal project management, business analysis approaches. And you don't hear much of it in web development, web production, web design industry. It's just sort of a crossover kind of, so what I wanted to do in this talk is sort of highlight it as a really, it's actually a process that we do all the time in work and non-work, professional, hardcore or not hardcore, consulting. It's a very simple concept, but it's been formalized a little bit, and there are some tools that like kind of really distill the process down or help achieve the goals that it intends to achieve that I wanted to share and to sort of contextualize a little bit in terms of what we do in our business. So I'm Chris. I'm a former geologist, still in my heart, technologist, team builder, trainer, product designer, and technical evangelist. Hey, no, I did. Okay. We're good. Thanks. I started as a developer, designer, freelancer about 10 years ago, and then sort of had a switch to project manager, taking on more projects than I could do as a freelancer, and that kind of grew into a business. And we're now a nice size small business. We're now about 6 project managers and 6 developers, and a business administrator type person, and a lot. It's evolving actually dramatically now, but it's exciting. We're a nice size shop. We have great synergy, and we're doing beautiful projects, big complex websites, building against application interfaces, APIs. We're using mostly Drupal. Probably 80–90% of our work is Drupal. I've loved Drupal as an web architecting tool since the fairly early days. And it's been fun to see it evolve, and it's evolving immensely now. So it's kind of cool to be part of that culture and the open source community around it. We do a lot of contrib back to Drupal. And we also use a technology called Magento, which is a fantastic, robust, very featured e-commerce platform, sort of pseudo open source. There's an enterprise level that's not free, and there's a community edition that's free. And mostly we do community edition, and a couple of clients go for enterprise, and we're doing some really great enterprise work on Magento. We also do a lot of partnering with agencies and firms, design agencies, branding agencies, and that's actually an interesting piece of this, because part of gap analysis means, and obviously I'll get to what it means in a second, but part of it is about kind of closing the information gap that can get even more complex when you have multiple parties involved. Like if you're working one-to-one with a client and understanding their needs, that's one thing. If you're working with an agency, third party, it gets more interesting and can be complicated. Just quick poll, how many folks are project managers? How many folks are more business development? How many folks are developers, programmers, and anything else? Just here for the ride. Really bored on a Saturday. That would be impressive if you just showed up. So anyway, so what is this about? So every project, every concept of a project, every scale, big or small, is ultimately an existential question, which is kind of cool, right? Someone comes to you, they want a thing, and that thing exists or it doesn't exist. It's like, it's a dream, it's a upgrade, whatever it is, it doesn't exist. And so the question is, how will this thing come to be? That's a pretty cool thing. That's a kind of fun thing about a theoretical thought about project management. And so what is this gap? The gap is basically like, well, what do we know about what you have? And what do we know about what you want? And how are we going to get, what information is needed to get there? Sometimes it's like plain as day, but a lot of times it isn't. In fact, it's more often unclear what the needs are than they're clear. And so we've got these various things, various flavors in that spectrum of super well understood, high confidence level understanding of what is and what needs to be. Often there's an attempt made to sort of lay it out, like here's what we know, and then here's even what we don't know, and then there's like this weird nebulous thing out there, which is like things that, because we're limited in our predictive abilities, we can only go so far in anticipating what we don't know, and we might find, oh, we build this thing and that created a dependency we weren't even aware of. So it's good to just have at least a general sense that that's always possible, and ultimately it'd be nice to start to quantify those things or even qualitatively understand those things. And so in our world, and you could certainly generalize this to almost any subject, but what we care often about are things like these gaps of information often take the form of, they're generally informational, but in terms of like the assets of a website, things like the navigation, the pages, the content, the images, the other kinds of assets, they are whatever they are at the moment that you're starting a project, especially if it's a legacy project. If you're starting from scratch, it's different, but even then there's an inventory, right? Because we want a new website. Great, do you have a logo? Well, that's part of your inventory. Do you have branding? Do you have a mission statement? Do you have an identity? There's an inventory of things that start even when you're, or at least questions to come up with, even when you're starting from scratch on a website. So it's just really great to have that understood and documented. There's also baseline technical questions that come up that are part of a gap analysis, such as like, Great, we're going to redesign this website. It's going to be awesome. Where is it hosted? Oh, we forgot to ask that. Oh man, how could you forget to ask that? That's like the most obvious thing in the world. Well, you'd be amazed at how often that gets kind of sort of forgotten, let alone what are the access credentials and what's the protocol that you as a firm have for communicating secure information. That is no standards across the industry. We as an agency are always like pushing for those kinds of standards and protocols and making sure that there's good coverage and things when it comes to those routine things, but they're not a given. Communication is like the whole other kind of, there's a range of communication gaps that can come up generally in terms of like, how are we working as a team? Are we clear on like what the protocols are for like, is there a point of contact? Is there a single point of contact? Is there multiple point of contacts? What are the groups? What are the communication channels? That often is like very vague in the beginning and needs to be sorted. Then there's sort of gaps that can be analyzed using gap analysis related to resource management. Like what resources do we have to bring to bear in going from something to nothing? What are those resources? Who are those people? Do we have the necessary talents to achieve this, given the goals? So certainly we want to know those goals. Even that is something where, what are your goals? We kind of want something. Okay, we got to get a little more specific. So whatever those goals are, we need to make sure that we have the talents to bear. And it can be a chicken and egg, to say the least, where if the goals aren't clear, you don't necessarily know the resources that you need to bring to bear. And that's a very common problem that we encounter, especially in bigger projects, but even smaller projects. And then there's like just generally like the wish list versus reality question, which is you have a dream, beautiful, awesome, inspiring, but there's also this thing called phase one. And so actually understanding the difference between phase one and the dream is a really useful thing. And so we'll look at a methodology for achieving that clarity on that point. And so what comes in ranges dramatically as what we call inputs on the business development side. Anywhere from this sort of email, which is sort of tongue-in-cheek, but it's actually painfully not far from reality. And I mean, with even very serious, otherwise qualified business leads, this is the kind of input that you can get. We need a thing, we need a forum, we need an integration to something. Okay, great, that's wonderful. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you can have like kind of just like miles of red tape RFPs. And it's like, oh, wow, this is going to be great. They've done all their homework, because how could they not have? What could comprise 50 pages of RFP if not homework and specification and clarity on scope and clarity on all these things that we care about as producers? And you read them and you're like, wow, there's not a single useful piece of information in here. Or maybe there's a few, but they beg more questions than they answer. And that's has anybody dealt with RFPs here? Does that sort of ring a bell? I mean, they're infamous, and there's even an anti-RFP movement, which is heartwarming. But the problem with RFPs isn't it's just a document. It can be great, it can be lousy. A good RFP achieves that piece of the goal definition well, meaning it keeps the gap down to a minimum, meaning it's clear on what it knows and what it doesn't know. It's clear on what the gaps are. It's even clear on, in more sophisticated ones, it's even clear what the risks are. We're aware, like good RFPs say, we are aware these are the risks because there's lack of definition around this. We are aware that we don't know who the resource will be on this. This RFP is geared toward you as this specific kind of vendor that has these specializations, but we're aware that we're going to need these talents as well. So there's risk to the timeline or the budget in that form. That is a very rare thing to get that. But we need to help get there some way or the other, because ultimately we're going to be accountable for a deadline or a budget. And so there's this, I was just sort of getting into this, like the sort of rare sweet spot, clear inputs and specifications. I kind of covered this. So establish budget goals, clarity and kind of realism regarding schedule. That's like the least I've literally never seen that. We know this is going to take 2.5 years because the discovery is going to take 9 months to get approval. Oh, no, I never heard that. Or discovery should be 3 weeks. No problem. Confidence levels, understanding of risks, and then contingency, like understanding that like there's a cost to risk, and that's achievable with a literal dollar amount or percentage. And we typically make our proposals with contingency, just with that in mind. From our perspective, it's important for us to, certainly it's critical for us to understand the risk on a project, because it could amount to the difference between like making money, breaking even, or taking a loss. So we have a very like sensitive relationship to risk as a business. So what are we going to do? We're going to try a couple of different. This is sort of a outline of this general steps, and sort of even thinking about getting to something called gapping analysis, and being so bold as to even use the term, because it's pretty geeky, kind of a jargony term, and you want to use it wisely. So first of all, you want to really understand where is this RFP or proposal or email from your aunt? Where is this on the spectrum of like well understood, well contained, well constrained scope of work with realistic expectations, anywhere from that to that email? Where is it? That's the first thing to start to wrap your head around. You want to then decide how you're going to attack the problem. Like there's situations where you're going to try to solve it right there on the spot if it's a basic problem, but that can be cavalier. It can be pretty risky. You don't really want to wing it. Or it may really deserve to be projectized. Like your gap, we'd love to do business with you, but the gap in the knowledge base between your A and your B is so broad, the risks are so high, that the only way it really makes sense is to like projectize the discovery, where the end goal is closing that gap. And that's a hard business decision to make, because it kind of looks like saying no. But the trick and the art of it is to say, that information needs to happen anyway. So it's not saying no, it's saying kind of not yet. But that still can sound like a no if it's, I don't know, too harsh or something. Sometimes it can be a little bit like, oh man, we thought we knew. No, not for us. We don't have enough to go on here. And then the gap itself. So how are we going to actually like try to, whether it's in the course of a pre-sales scenario or a discovery phase that's dedicated, or a discovery phase that's part of a bigger project, these techniques can come up in all those scales. So we'll look at a number of like actually pretty different scenarios that should illustrate it. So again, like, where does it fall? This is sort of, honestly, it takes experience. It takes an understanding of the full production pipeline in very granular detail. It takes some experience with understanding what the scale of a project is, because the risks, you might have the same exact problem on a tiny project and a very large project, the same exact problem. And let's just pick one, which is there isn't clarity on who the content writer is. No one knows that yet. The client's just learning, oh, you need a copywriter for a website? Yeah. Or you have a major institution that has a 10,000 page inventory, and is it a simple migration, or will there be actual content work happening as well? Oh, well, now that we think about it, there probably will be content work. Okay, same exact response is you need a content person. $1,000 project, $100,000 project, same problem. So that's an important thing to understand, like that the risk on a bigger project is kind of linearly or non-linearly related to the scale. So that's kind of the first thing, is like just deciding whether some sort of gap analysis is even recommended. Really essential, and a little bit off the exact topic, but very relevant, which is that, and I mentioned this earlier, the question of the stakeholder gap and the resource gap can really just be like the make or break factor in a project. If the right people aren't available, either from your firm or yourself as an individual, as a participant, or your whoever, the right people aren't there, it can really just, I can't really emphasize enough how essential that is. And to identify that as a gap sometimes can be tricky on the sales process. Like you're on a call with one person, but you're seeing that this is a project that's like got a lot of moving parts, a lot of people, or it's going to require people, but you're just on a conversation with one person. To convey that, either that person is kind of versed in that kind of problem, or there's some opportunity for client education right there. And just understanding, like, given the scale, like being really direct in terms of saying, this is an important thing. You need to hire a copywriter, and that needs to go on the timeline and really account for that. So that's just like one example, but there's many where understanding the stakeholder landscape and the gap between what it is and what it needs to be is really essential. Then there's this question of, like, how much do you do before you actually have a contract? Because often, especially with RFPs, very often, and even really across the board, you don't know what this is like. You don't necessarily know how much work is going to be needed to get to a point where your comfort levels are strong enough to engage and to be able to proceed on a scope of work, bearing in mind that there are big gaps. It's just sort of it's kind of a question of, like, how much risk are you willing to sustain across the pre-sales sales divide, if that makes sense. So yeah, there's a decision there, and it's sort of a personality choice to some degree, or a question of your business model and who you're working with. Obviously, it varies a lot, but just the question of how much work do you do in sort of like closing the critical pieces of the gap. And a common example is, like, what's the architecture of your system? What technologies do you need to use? Less technical clients don't know the answer to that. That's honestly why they're hiring you, potentially. But that's a big question and can massively influence, like, the estimates and the budgets and just the project overall. Well, if you're not really clear on that, like, what technologies are you going to use? You're really potentially sustaining a lot of risk in signing that contract, because you're either going to get into, like, solving these deep contractual scope questions after you've already committed by signature, or you're not. You're just having to make that decision. So that's an important thing to, like, in terms of, like, this gap, this information gap, and again, ultimately, whether you apply these gap analysis techniques to a thing before or after. It's a very tricky thing, and putting a name to it is sort of the point of the talk here, which is, if you see that scenario where it's like, well, we don't even have confidence levels that we know the appropriate technologies, or you mentioned in passing, like, 9 API potential integration points. Are those documented? No. Okay, so it's just a question of, like, deciding how far to go before you kind of pull the plug and say, we'd love to work with you, but we need a discovery phase. We're not going to respond to this RFP as it's been framed. And so just keep that kind of thing in mind. So a little bit of theory. So what are we doing? First of all, we need to understand what are we trying to achieve, and then what are our baselines. And the baselines can be a whole range of things. I mentioned a few. It's ultimately information asset, whether it's technical assets, content assets, architecture assets, API endpoint assets, etc. You need to know where you are and where you need to go. And then depending on what kinds of gaps there are, and you'll see there's, like, a vast range, it's honestly an infinite range, you'll craft your strategy and your tools to close the gap. And basically the tools that I'm going to be showing are, like, very cheap and easy to create. You probably are doing them already. There's nothing necessarily, like, earth-shattering about what this is. It's really just a perspective. But they're basically spreadsheets with different filters in one form or another. There's certainly, like, other assets that can come about and tools that can come about besides spreadsheets, but that's kind of what it comes down to. And then there's the question of, like, Well, now you've done this, you've framed the problem, you've identified the gap, you've identified the inventory, the endpoints, and now you can actually like use your filters to say, okay, here's a list of things, and that is like what we don't know, or that is the gap, the nuts and bolts of the gap. We're looking at the gap in the eye, and now we can say for each thing on that list, what are we going to do to resolve it? Because as of now, it's unresolved. Otherwise, it wouldn't be showing up in the gap. And so just a little bit of sort of generalized theory about just project management and discovery and this process of moving through this sort of consultation is that at least in a traditional web production pipeline, and this is true in other media as well, typically there's, as you build up your information about a system that you're building or defining, each process point is basically like feeding information to the next. Does that make sense? Like you're doing a discovery, or it starts really with like the first sales conversation and the RFP, and that's giving you like 40% resolution on what you need. And then you go into discovery and you do things like wireframes. And you each of these process points actually is anticipating the next. And so what you're doing, aside from the idea that you may need to like pull the plug and do a formal gap analysis, you are actually consistently doing closing of the gap in terms of like that, reducing the information uncertainty, increasing the resolution. And so specs anticipate wireframes anticipate graphic design concepts or HTML prototypes. And then those anticipate actual like a functioning piece of software that's testable and actually getting close to your deliverable. But even then it's like, you're not quite there until you're through QA. So it's close, but it's not quite there. And then you've launched. And then even then there's still like, this is a system that is anticipating its future self, which is a maintained system. Like its core has been updated, for example. Well, that's different than when we launched. So it's still always kind of achieving something and anticipating the next thing. So that's the sort of a side bit of theory about the process of information gathering in general. But now we're going to look at some examples of like where there's really a gap, a typical gap. Some of these will be very familiar, or certainly the first one will be. But let's just look at the first one. So almost every web design development project that is taking an old site and upgrading it, redesigning it, changing the CMS, upgrading the CMS, whatever it is. I'd say something like 80–90% of our projects, for better or worse, I don't know if this is good or bad, but are legacy projects. Like we have this stinky old ASP classic site, we want to build it on Drupal. Beautiful. Well, you have you have a website. It's big and it's old and it's clunky, but it has a lot of time and money and sometimes passion that went into getting it to what it is. We take that really seriously, not just for like, cushy-feely reasons, but like it's really important to understand what that thing is that you're bringing to the table because it has so much information in it. In a very literal way, it has a bunch of URLs in it. It's literally pages with content on them. And your new site may have a one-to-one relationship between those pages and the new site web pages, or not. Most cases it's not, but it's often rarely none. It's rarely that we're going to just throw out that whole system and just like really start from scratch with brand new content. That's pretty rare. And more likely on larger sites, you have a list of pages that are going to live in a new form on the new website. And so understanding that with like crystal clarity is essential, not just but because you also need to account for them in 3 or 1 redirects, meaning you need to make sure that all those old URLs that are bookmarked and indexed by search engines and wherever else they live in the world, printed on brochures, printed on business cards, that every time those old URLs are loaded, which may diminish over time, but it won't diminish on day one, they need to be properly routed to their new home. So there's a very mechanical reason that this needs to be done. But there's other reasons too. So we're just going to take a quick look at an example of one of these. We do these all the time. And I'm slapping the name gap analysis onto this, and whatever. That's you can decide whether it's a useful concept, but I think it is, because you'll see like the approach is similar, and it transects all sorts of like kinds of project management. And one of them is that in all of these spreadsheets, there's always an action column, which is of course the juicy one. It's the interesting one. Well, who's going to fix this, or who's going to close this gap, whatever it is. And let's filter by that person. So here's a task list for that person that just emerges from this gap analysis. It's pretty beautiful. And so this, don't read this, don't even try. I will share this with anybody who asks, or I'll post it somewhere, like on a blog on our website or something. And so let's see if that even shows. It seems to show. And so what is this? It's basically a spreadsheet. And this is, I did a little bit of anonymizing it, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the idea here is that what you're doing is simply building inventory of the pages on the old, or in this case, it looks like the client actually also included the new. But typically what you see is an old, like a list of all the legacy URLs. Then there's other columns of kind of relevant metadata. And what the relevant metadata is will change from project to project, but typically on a sitemap style inventory, things that you typically care about are what is the old URL? What will the new URL be? Is there some sort of redirect logic? Sometimes pages or URLs were bouncing users right off a website. That can be documented. Sometimes they're pointing directly to PDFs, for better or worse. We typically discourage that. We'll do an associated template type sometimes, not always. And then there's a content, who's responsible for that content? What's the status on that content in terms of whether is it ready for content entry, or does it need to be written? And then what are the actions? Migrate the content or compose, for example. And so pretty straightforward. Has anybody built this spreadsheet in the course of supporting a web production project? Not this specific field set, but something like it. Yeah, okay. So cool. Yeah, so so how is this a gap analysis? Well, it basically is an opportunity to ask questions on such things as, what is the gap between how close we are to being ready to migrate content and not? That's a pretty basic gap analysis, but it is one. And the way you achieve it is just by using this filter. And you just make up these filters as they're relevant. And so here's a really simple example. So this is what's ready for content entry. Great. Let's assign that to Joe and build a task list and get it done. Just close the gap. So that's a simple one. Any questions about that? I mean, pretty intuitive. Okay, so if we go to, let's see, some more interesting. Feature matrix. So we've worked with a number of startups over the years, and who approach us to say we want to build a product, a web application kind of product, or mobile, or API, or something like that. And the inputs when it comes to like, what are we building? All right, we see your business plan and it's great, and we're totally want to help you, and it's going to be awesome. But what do you want specifically? What will the features of this product be? Oh, yeah, we have this sketch. Okay, good start. And we want to do this, and we want to do that, and we want to do this crazy other thing that we don't even know if it's possible, but we want to try. Great, awesome. Okay, and what you end up with is a thing like this, which is what I just called raw inputs. And this is an inventory. It's a very different kind of inventory than like the inventory of a sitemap, but it is an inventory all the same. And so what we're doing here is saying, this is from brainstorm, brain dumps, workshops, wherever it could be extracted from like business plan documents, however you're arriving at this kind of list of features. And this is for a product, for a startup, but you could say the same kind of thing for just like a straight up CMS as well. And what you have here is kind of fun, but it's not terribly actionable, right? it's a lot of features lined up with no hierarchy, no categorization, no nothing, no assessment about feasibility, no nothing. So what we want to do is organize this into and do a gap analysis. And what is it? The gap analysis in this particular case is not asking like what was the one before. Is this content ready to get populated? So that's a gap analysis. This is a kind of more challenging and interesting one, which is what is feasible in phase one on your budget in terms of features, and what is feasible but maybe not in your budget, or maybe for other business reasons not a great idea to put in your initial version of your product. You maybe want to do a more agile approach or a lean approach where you like test less features earlier and add features as you actually get information from users, not just from your predictive imagination. Very interesting question. A lot of strategy goes into that kind of thinking. And sorry, then there's probably one other category, which is like, this isn't even feasible using current day technology. So determining what category each of these feature ideas is really critical, because you need to ultimately say, here's what we're doing and here's what we're holding off on. That's a really key thing. And here are the resources involved and the cascade of questions that come out from that. And so what we did for these guys was put together, and this one doesn't have the filtering set up just because we didn't do it in that particular way in this version. But you'll get the idea, which is that we essentially categorized the feature set by whether is this something that's like related to this part of the animal, or is it related to this part of the animal? Is it based on this kind of feature set? It's just essentially an organization. We actually give those classes, so this lends itself to filtering. If we wanted to just look at the things that are relevant to framework and nav, we could sort by that. And then there's feedback, and in that particular case, and then there's this really critical decision, which is this thing essential for launch, critical for POC, in this case is proof of concept? Is it a nice to have, meaning like we can live without that? Let's hold off on that for now. And that was it. That was actually the two categories that were relevant. It was just either yes or no, in or out. And that was fine. There are other nuances that could be added to this. And then there are other metadata details related to this. So this is, again, like, how is this a gap analysis? It's essentially going from this kind of raw, ponderous, disorganized list of features to an action plan related to phase and scoping, and an action plan related to product definitions. Like, what are the feature sets in this class? What are the feature sets in this class? And this now opens up all sorts of doors to things like information architecture. How are we going to actually wireframe the product interfaces up? Will we have a very clear sense of, well, what are the features that need to go in those wireframes? Whereas from this list, I don't know. I don't know, where should I start? Well, hold on, don't start on anything yet. Let's do a gap analysis first. Okay, so that's that product. And I sort of covered these. You're asking business critical questions. What's the minimal viable product? That's like the term you'll hear more often. And I actually think that concept should apply to, quote, typical brochure informational portals and CMSs more often than it does. It does somewhat, but there's still like this sense that, like, no, we want to do everything now, or in this phase, everything has to happen in this phase. And that everything could be like, hundreds of thousands of dollars of work and years of work. And it's like, in 2 years, these technologies won't even necessarily be stable. Why would you build against that big of a scope? So we encounter this, and I'm often evangelizing the agile methodology, more agile or more MVP approach, even on kind of enterprise level or educational sites, things like that. And then you're organizing your features into classes or by tier or whatever is relevant. But typically something like a category system is a good idea, or even including subcategories. And then from there you can start doing project management, because before that you're a little bit over, there's a little too much chaos to manage. So that's sort of where this can fall in. And so here are the fields, and there's a link to that if anybody wants to poke around. And so here's more advanced. So product development can be as complicated as anything in the world, but the reason I consider this a little bit more complex is because when you're doing a system migration or an integration project, you're not only dealing with like the question of like legacy URLs, like old and new URLs and 301 redirects. Like that's pretty straightforward. Like most folks get their head around that pretty quickly. What if let's say you have a project which is overbuilt. Has anybody worked with a project where like the system was like, had so many pieces built into it that it became rigid or became fragile? Like so many features were added over so many years by so many developers that you're just kind of like, and you're a new developer or you're potentially thinking about working with this system, and you look at it and you're like, that's going to take a while to even like wrap our heads around what was built. And so that kind of system, one possibility for it is to start over. Another possibility is to sort of fork it and to kind of decouple some of the things that are baked in, if that makes sense, on overbuilt systems. And so we've run into projects like this before. It's pretty common where you have like a legacy system that just kind of get patched and piled and featured and content, and then finally it's like so chaotic it's unmanageable. We're going to move to a new system. And what often is the case is we're going to isolate like a typical example is we're going to just make the site, for example, if it's a Drupal CMS, for example, we're just going to use that for content, which is sort of a good use of Drupal. I mean, certainly you can do anything you want with Drupal, but that's a pretty good common use case for Drupal. And for this CRM function that was baked in with some clever modules, that's going to go in a CRM, and it's going to have an API. Beautiful. And for all these forms that we built in Drupal that are actually not even feeding the CRM, they're feeding this very special system, those are no longer going to be in Drupal either. We're going to extract those. Very cool. Great. Good plan. Most architects would agree that's a good idea. So, but you're only here now, and you've maybe identified, you're pretty sure this is your CRM, and you're pretty sure this is your form handler data set, database, whatever that's going to be. Or even you are sure, you've even identified the vendor that's going to be doing that. And you've identified the vendor that's going to be doing that. And the question then is, you're still running fully on this legacy Drupal system. How are we going to get there? How are we going to get from that nice, cruddy, old, clunky system that just barely holds itself together with some very folks that have been working in the organization for 8 years and have all that information in their head? How are you going to get from that to this nice, clean, shiny new architecture? That's a hard problem. That's like, I consider that a hard problem. It's a doable thing. It happens all the time. It always takes longer than people thought. And so this is like a perfect opportunity to like employ some of this kind of thinking, this gap analysis kind of thinking. So the methodology is essentially the same, but the questions that you're asking can be kind of harder in some ways. And so you start with your system requirements. So this is more important, I think, for this kind of project than others. Understanding requirements is always, of course, essential. But in this particular case, you need to understand in a very technology-free way, what are your business requirements, regardless of whether they happen to be built in Drupal or they will be built in this system. What are your business requirements? Where have those been documented? And that's something that, especially with legacy systems, is often non-existent. There's no concept of, everyone just kind of knows the business requirements. We're using the system, just look at the code. The business requirements are the code. And we're like, not really, because we're going to be getting rid of 90% of this code. So that's not a really reliable source. We should have another thing called the requirements. Now this is like obviously less agile. This is like a little bit more of a waterfall thing, but it's almost unavoidable because when you're asking questions of these systems, like of this legacy system, you need to hold the truth, like the value of that thing against some truth of this is what we need to do. This is what we need to accomplish. This data needs to exist somewhere. And this is why, because there's a transaction involved. Well, that's a business requirement. That's not like we use the Drupal X module. No, we need to know what that thing is, because that may not live in Drupal even, right? So that's a hard thing, and it takes some time to even get stakeholders on board with that at times. Like usually it makes sense ultimately, like especially on a big complex system with like lots of IT folks. Most folks will respond positively to the need for like having business requirements, but it can be surprising how often they're just not there, or that wasn't even identified as like part of the project plan. And so that would be really recommended. If that doesn't exist, take the time to nothing overly formal, but necessary. You know, whatever's necessary to have a baseline of information that you're mapping your technology decisions against and your inventory of components against. So again, baselines and inventory. Inventory is as essential here as ever. It's not a site URL inventory. It's not a feature, or it's not even a feature inventory. It's there's an inventory here, which is what are the entities that what are the entities in the system that we need to account for one way or the other. Is this thing going to live here or there? And that's a question that you can wing it, but it comes at it's a very risky way to do it. And we've seen attempts to wing it, even on very expensive, complex systems. And so listing the entities and asking that question of each, and the question's a little bit more interesting than will it, I mean, it's will it exist, but there's more to it. So yeah, let me just explain that. So for a particular feature, let's just pick this, stay with this example. It's like a Drupal site, and it's going to get like split up into like the Drupal's only going to do this, and the business functions are going to get offloaded to like this API and this CRM. Cool, great, that's a good plan. All right, well, let's look at this specific feature. It lives in Drupal now. First question is, what requirement does that match to? We don't know. Okay, well, let's start with that. Let's just say we got through that. Great, it maps to this requirement. Does it not map to any requirement because it's no longer needed? Oh, we have this for like 8 years, but yeah, we don't need it anymore. Great, good to know. Let's get that off the list. We're making progress. We just reduced our load by this much. Is that feature working is a good thing to know. Maybe it's buggy. Maybe it's like in the business requirements and there isn't even a plan for it, but it's actually not really working right now. Good to know, because someone's maintaining the system until you go to this new system. All right, little side task, someone maintain this bug or fix this bug. So there's the next question, which is, so it may or may not be needed. It may or may not be mapping to a requirement. Hopefully the requirement's everyone agrees to it. And then the second question is, where will it live after the transition? Is it going to stay in Drupal in its clean, stable, non-buggy form, or is it going to get moved over there? And now we have a lot of information from which we can do our simple filtering thing and say, here's the list of things that we are chucking. Spend not a dime of resources on those things. They were somehow buried in there, and no one was clear that like, oh, well, we don't even have to do all that stuff. Great, you just gave yourself a little surplus of something. Let's filter this list now by what are features that are buggy? Good to know. That's a useful thing. Here's a nice bug list, someone. What are the features that need more documentation because we're not clear on whether they're going to stay or go? Great to know. So whatever it is, you're going to be building kind of a big picture plan of what is otherwise a complex system, and asking a series of gap analysis questions to kind of reduce the scariness level, and obviously ultimately the risk level. And so this spreadsheet is here. And yeah, and when we got in there on this project, we saw that there was years and years and years and years of work. And we saw that many of the things were not even used, but they were just kind of in there. They were disabled modules. Okay. Do those need to be maintained by someone? I don't know. Do they need to be ported? Do they need to even be accounted for? The theory is yes, they should. If they're disabled modules, there's an opportunity for like trimming them when you're building a new clean system that's clean Drupal, these business function handled elsewhere. And so all those questions are answered in terms of, is this feature required? Is this feature nice to have but not essential? Is this no longer required? And then there's tasks around those things and actions around those things. So does that example, that class of kind of make sense? Okay. And so then there's this fun one that we're kind of going through right now, where, you know, companies are in the situation where it's like there's X number of projects coming in, and you have X staff, and there's only so many hours in the week. Do we need to hire? Who do we need to hire? Can we reassign projects? Those are challenging questions that there's different tools out there for addressing them. We actually built one that's not quite addressing it for us, so we're using kind of the old-fashioned spreadsheet for the moment. But what we're doing with a spreadsheet in this particular case is another kind of gap analysis. So what's the question in this case? Where are our so just to kind of frame it a little bit. So we have a list of projects. We kind of classify them in different ways by their complexity, by their handoff ability, both from the project management perspective as well as the development perspective. Then there's like an action column, and then there's a recruit column, and then there's a technology type. So we can just framing this spreadsheet just gives you the power to ask these gap analysis questions. So for example, if we were to bring on a new Drupal developer, what would be the projects that would be candidates to hand off? So let's just look at the maybes and the yeses. And there we have it. We have a nice list of projects. You know, so this is now potentially justifying a hire. That's a useful thing to know. We could do the same thing for a different technology. And so this is just a kind of a nice sort of utterly unrelated to like classical like discovery, like we were talking about with these other kind of production scenarios, but like even just like figuring out like traffic problems, you are kind of doing a gap analysis with this kind of a tool. And we're hiring project managers and developers, speak of the devil. So yeah, thank you. Yeah. Any thoughts, questions? Yeah.
So I'm busy at the last call.
Oh, cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Got the fish, and
right.
are just trying to make sure that you make them happy.
Right.
I actually get into a lot of, or have a lot of experience in reading those proposals that they think are great, and so I don't have a lot of access to them to do a back.
Yeah, it makes it even harder.
So how do you apply the principles of gap analysis when someone says we want a design that is vibrant with depth?
Honestly, I would use some. Hey, I would use some shock tactics as needed. Like you really need to get their attention if you're seeing this, and you're risking not being the nice guy to a degree. But you're also building credibility. I actually skipped over that point somewhere in there, that like one of the advantages of doing this or pushing for it, whether you call it a gap analysis or not, is like you be the judge. Like it's a dorky term. There's no question about it. It's like, you know, we're all in the craft, so it's okay. But whether that's a sales friendly term, I'm pretty judicious about using it. But in your mind, you're thinking this is kind of what's needed. This analysis is needed. And using logical spreadsheet filtering is a pretty easy way to do it. There's nothing that hard about it, but it's like you're bringing a huge amount of value to the conversation in suggesting it in some form. Now, it's a little bit rare just honestly, like where I pitched this as part of like a lead cultivation process, like it's a little harsh to be like, we'll talk to you once we've done our gap analysis. Maybe it can make sense. We haven't done it much. It's more in the course of discovery more generally. And so what we are often doing is pitching discovery phases. We're not necessarily calling it gap analysis, but it is a gap. That's what's needed ultimately. And so there's lots of better language than gap analysis for like pitching a discovery phase. Needs assessment. That's a lovely one. Needs assessment just sounds great. It's like social work. We just need a needs assessment. What do you need? Well, it is a needs assessment actually. That is a very good synonym for it. And it's a little bit of a hard sell, you know. It takes a lot of effort to get an RFP out the door. It's like a bureaucratic exercise. It's a political exercise to get an RFP out the door. So if you're going to say, thank you for your RFP, we'd love to be participating, how about a discovery phase? They're like, whoa, it took us a year to get this thing. And now you're telling us it's not good enough? Sorry, it's kind of needs some work. We can't estimate based on this level of unknown. It's too much risk. Well, that's a question for the business. There are higher risk. There are ways to mitigate that, obviously, depending on a lot of things in your business, like your scale, your capacity to like eat cost if necessary, other strategy questions like, is it worth taking the risk on this because it's positioning us for other work in that industry? So it's not a simple question whether how hard you push for discovery, knowing that like you might just get a no way. But honestly, like as a small business, which we are, we cannot afford that risk. We just can't. It will kill us. Like that vagueness will just be like, what do we do with this? Now we're going to legal contract renegotiation. We can't afford that. We need to understand what we're doing. So we push pretty hard for it. And I don't know what our percentages are, but it's become pretty common. Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.